Okay, so we're very happy, it's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Emily Bender. I've greatly admired her work. I'm most familiar with her work in grammar engineering. She's developed a system called the Lingo Grammar Matrix that generates HPSG grammars from sets of specifications that are designed to accommodate a wide typological range of languages. And the other thing about it is that they're computational grammars in the sense they can drive parsers, be used to drive language processing. And what I've been found particularly impressive is a class that she teaches or has taught in which students pick a language and actually develop a grammar during the course of the term. That's something that I would love to emulate myself. So more broadly, one of the things that she's known for is the relationship between linguistics and computational linguistics, how linguistics can help natural language processing and vice versa, how natural language processing computation can be used in service of research in linguistics. She's written a book that provides linguistic training for computer scientists. And she's also the LSA's official delegate to the Association for Computational Linguistics. She's a professor of linguistics at the University of Washington. She currently holds the Howard and Frances Nostrand Endowed Professorship. She's also an adjunct professor in computer science, and she's the director of the Professional Master's Program in Computational Linguistics. And that's a program that a number of our undergraduate alumni have gone on to. So she'll be talking today on the topic of meaning making with artificial interlocutors and risks of language technology. And welcome, Emily, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve, and to everyone for your attention and for inviting me to be part of this amazing talk series. Now let me share my slides. I should say that class, my grammar engineering class, actually will happen again. I've been able to teach it annually since the 03-04 school year, minus the years that I was on sabbatical. And I'm looking forward to doing it again, starting in January. And we now actually work from starter grammar specifications that are created automatically on the basis of interlinear gloss text. So if anyone in the audience is the sort of linguist who goes and does primary language description and documentation and produces IGT and is possibly interested in having a computational grammar built for them by my students, please hit me up. I would love to hear about that and work with additional languages. Today's talk definitely fits into the sort of what do linguistics and natural language processing have to say to each other theme. In this case, I'm thinking about what linguists know about meaning making and how that informs how we think about and build conversational agents and other kinds of language technology that ends up in conversation with humans. A couple other bookkeeping things. I've got a bit.ly link to my slides. The version that you can find at that link also has the bibliography at the end. So if you see anything on these slides that you want to get your hands on, that's how you can get to it. And I want to say that I was very fortunate to get to attend your colloquium 2 weeks ago when it was Dr. Tracy Connor's turn. And I really enjoyed what she did with the chat and inviting the audience to blow up the chat with comments and reactions. And I know that I don't have the charisma as a speaker that she does, but I hope that you will do the same for me in the chat if you are so inspired. And then finally, I also want to acknowledge the land that I'm on here in the city we call Seattle, coming to you from the University of Washington, or from my home near the University of Washington as it happens. The University of Washington is on the land of the Coast Salish people, and that is the land which touches the shared waters of all the tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And just recently, University of Washington student, now alumnus, has produced this wonderful Indigenous walking tour of our campus with illustrations by, I believe, another student, although I don't know that for sure. And so if you're interested in learning more about the land here and the peoples who belong to this land, I highly recommend this document. So it's a wonderful tour that works well virtually, and perhaps one day you can come visit us as well. All right, so moving into the talk, here's the sort of nutshell version of where I'm going. And again, one more time, the link to the slides. After this, it will only reappear at the end of the talk. As humans, we are remarkably quick to make meaning of any language we encounter, provided it belongs to a linguistic system that we understand. And as we're doing that, we are imagining a mind behind that language. In contrast, artificial agents have at best a limited capacity for communicative intent, and some natural language systems have none. This means that if we want to actually mitigate some of the risks of language technology, we have to recognize that disconnect and account for it rather than taking advantage of it, as it seems like some systems do to seem more proficient than they really are. So in outline, I'm going to talk some about meaning making in human-human conversation, and then talk about computers and communicative intent, and then talk about what happens when humans encounter computer-generated text, including some failure modes and risks, and then end with some mitigation strategies. So you may have heard of this example before. Halliday in 1970 published this example that he noticed in the London Underground, the sign that says dogs must be carried. And so how do people interpret this? Well, let's say we've got this one person with their cute little poodle and they're like, all right, up you go. And then another passenger has this enormous dog and is thinking, oh no. Yet a third passenger, dog-free, walks by thinking, no muddy paws for me today. And then one more passenger says, no one told me I had to bring a dog. There's yet one more kind of passenger, which is the linguist, who might sit down and think about it. And if that linguist is Halliday, they might say, wow, interpretation depends on intonation, right? Dogs must be carried versus, sorry, I can't do that off the top of my head, but you get two interpretations of this. One is if you have a dog, you have to carry it. And the other is if you want to be on this, you have to be carrying a dog. And Halliday noticed that the interpretation there depended on the intonation. And Barbara Partee noticed that the truth conditions depend on information structure. So the linguist might sit down and just think about the message. Thank you for joining me in the chat there and for the explanation of why it was quiet. In all of the non-linguist cases, at least, the people interpreting the sign are concerned with the imagined mind of the person or committee of people who posted it. Who are they? What's the authority behind that rulemaking? What's the rule that they are trying to convey? How does that rule relate to me right now? All right. So a part of that lesson is that the meaning is actually not in the text, right? The meaning is something that we do with the text. And the first step of doing that is understanding the linguistic structure and standing meaning provided by the text. So this is probably utterly obvious to linguists, but I include this kind of slide when I talk about this to computer scientists because it turns out it's less obvious if you're not a linguist. So if you want to answer questions like, what does the sentence mean, or what does the speaker mean by uttering the sentence, you first have to actually get at what's in the linguistic structure of the sentence. And I illustrate this by putting up a sentence that I think is in a language that many of the people in the audience probably don't read or speak. If you do read this language, then you'll just have to imagine that I had picked a language that you don't read and also feel a little bit smug for the rest of you. Can you tell what this sentence means? Guessing not. How about if I go ahead and tell you that that's a sentence in Japanese? Does that help? Right? Not getting answers in the chat, but I'm just going to take silence as no in this case. All right. The next step was I went ahead and tokenized that. I put some white space between the words or word-like units. Can you understand yet? What if I gloss? Sorry, not gloss yet. What if I transliterate? Anyone understanding yet? Right. So for some folks, the non-transliterated version had the advantage of having kanji, which gave them some sense of some of the meanings. Now, all of a sudden, there's at least one, maybe two words. Yes, Matthew's feeling smug. At least one, maybe two words that you actually understand here. How about I give you glosses of the content words, but not the function words? Do you know what the sentence means yet? Still not there? What if I gloss the function words? Now, when I've presented this to NLP folks in the past, at this point, I can usually get someone to volunteer that they think they know what the sentence means, and they're usually wrong. because they're missing the information that Japanese is a head final language. And what the sentence means is, according to the teacher, girls like Pokemon more than boys do. That comparative is attaching to the reference point, and the reference point is before it. So the big picture here is that in order to get to that much meaning, in order to get to the standing meaning of the sentence, you need to know the linguistic system that the sentence belongs to. But there's more to it than that, right? So with that linguistic and grammatical and lexical knowledge, speakers can get from a text to a standing or conventional meaning, to use the words of Grice and Quine, but that's only the first step. The next step involves bringing in common sense and also coherence relations, so the ways in which the sentence relates to the discourse around it. And from that, we can get to what's called public commitments. That is what the person is actually on record as having said because they uttered that sentence with that structure in that context. You can go further. So there's the public commitments, and then some further reasoning gives what can be called perlocutionary consequences, which are things that they're not necessarily committed to, but that would be reasonable inferences. So in this short dialogue, A says, "I wonder whether I should take my umbrella. Is it raining?" And B says, "Yes." The standing meaning of yes is just something like agreement with deixis, right? Agreement with whatever the relevant antecedent in the discourse is. The coherence relation here is answer. Yes is an answer to is it raining? And so the public commitment of B is committed to the proposition that it is raining. A can go on and say, "Oh, so you do think I should take my umbrella?" And B can legitimately say, "I didn't say that." So that reasoning from it's raining, B believes it's raining, to B believes A should take A's umbrella is in this space of not quite public commitment, but perlocutionary consequences. And all of that is happening as processing of the language in context based on our understanding of the situation, of the person we're talking to, and so on. I highly recommend Herb Clark's book called Using Language, where he goes into detail about the idea that conversation is a joint activity. That is, it's something carried out by two or more participants. In that activity, they assume public roles that help determine their division of labor. And that's going to be things like speaker versus listener, or in this case, we have a speaker and an audience, but I really appreciate you not just being passive and giving me back stuff in the chat. In more of a one-on-one type conversation, you're going to alternate those roles between speaker and listener. In the joint activity, people will have shared public goals that they establish and try to achieve. And they may also have private goals, such as B wanting A to get wet in our example, and so on. So these are properties of conversation as a joint activity. I also really like this meditation by Baldwin around intersubjective awareness. And I'm going to read it because I think it's actually quite lovely. Technically speaking, joint attention simply means the simultaneous engagement of two or more individuals in mental focus on one and the same external thing. Put this way, joint attention is likely a ubiquitous occurrence for all organisms that boast a complex central nervous system. For instance, two bush babies alerted by a predator's call are caught in an instant of joint attention prior to pursuing their separate avenues of escape. Or to take a human case, perhaps you and I once unwittingly happened to watch Dr. Strangelove on the same night in the same time zone, thereby satisfying the criteria for joint attention. Clearly, this notion of simultaneous engagement fails to capture something central to our experience, that aspect of intersubjective awareness that accompanies joint attention, the recognition that mental focus on some external thing is shared. And of course, it is just this aspect of the joint attention experience, intersubjective awareness, that makes simultaneous engagement with some third party of such social value to us. It is because we are aware of simultaneous engagement that we can use it as a springboard for communicative exchange. And I think this gets at something really fundamental, not just about language use, but also language acquisition, that is often missing from the way that computational approaches right now are looking at learning language by doing language modeling, for example. When we are using language, it is not just packing information into strings and unpacking it, but actually one tool in this larger experience of the joint activity of communication in which we are intersubjectively aware of each other. All right, so what about meaning making at a distance in time and space? So far, the things I've been talking about are really to do with face-to-face small group communication, and that's the most well-studied and probably the most basic kind of linguistic activity. But we also communicate asynchronously and distantly, and we apply the same skills in doing so. And I went looking into the literature to find studies where people have looked into this in detail. And what I turned up was some work in the education literature that finds that developmental milestones in theory of mind are linked to reading comprehension. So kids' ability to actually understand written text, which is removed in time and space from the interlocutor, is correlated with where they are developmentally in terms of understanding minds of other people and how to sort of model that. And then you can also look into the hermeneutics literature, and I found this unusual but lovely paper by Ricoeur, which includes this statement here: not that we can conceive of a text without an author. The tie between the speaker and the discourse is not abolished, but distended and complicated. And so even when you're looking at texts that are really old, really far removed in time, we still understand them in terms of some notion of this was written by somebody. So when we're interpreting texts, we lack the ability to confirm and repair understandings like we do in interactive language use, but we can still project a model of mind, and we do, and that's important to our interpretation. So to summarize, when I'm talking about meaning making in human-human interaction, communication is a joint activity in which we use language among other signals to convey and understand communicative intents. And we do this even when not co-present with our interlocutors. All right, so moving on to computers. Can computers have communicative intent? This is probably a deep philosophical question, and I am no philosopher, but I'm going to have a go for the purposes of this talk at a provisional answer by looking at some examples. So before we get to computers, does that "the dogs must be Carrie's" sign that we were looking at, does that have communicative intent? No, it's just a piece of metal. It doesn't even have any moving parts. How could it possibly have in itself communicative intent? Rather, it represents the communicative intent of some person or group of people. What about a calculator? Does that have communicative intent? Well, it can produce answers to different questions. So maybe, although I think it's probably still best understood as representing the communicative intent of some group of people, and that intent is to provide accurate answers that are given accurate according to a given system of rules. What about a slot filling dialogue agent? And my example here is the air traffic information system stuff from the 90s. So this is you're talking to a virtual travel agent and asking it to help you book an airplane, right? So here the intent of the system might be to elicit information about the parameters of the flight scheduling request, and then in particular information that map to concepts in its database. And then it might have an intent to provide information about flights from the database that match the parameters of the request. And this, by the way, was early work on spoken dialogue systems. What about conversational agents that are chatbots, like the old ELIZA system, or modern day chatbots that are just sort of there to keep the conversation going and be sort of interesting? Arguably, the intent there is to output text that is engaging and on topic. But to me, that seems like it's tenuous and too far removed from the standing meaning of the text to actually be the communicative intent of the text. All right, setting aside intent, can computers have public commitments? Remember that standing meaning and common sense and coherence relations give us the public commitments. What are you on record as having said when you've uttered something? And it's a fun, interesting thing that you can be on record as having said something, even when the coherence relation part is covert, not actually directly mappable to anything in the string. So if a person is on record as having said something that turns out to be false, then we interpret them as either lying or having been misinformed. And they have some accountability in either case, right? But who or what is accountable for a machine's utterances? And how do we manage that as we're building artificial agents? I don't have the answer to that, but that's a question I want us to be asking. Finally, can computers recognize communicative intent in a human interlocutor? So again, The dogs must be carried sign? No, it's just a piece of metal. The calculator, limited, right? I wish I know what this expression evaluates to is an intent that it can recognize and deal with. What about that slot filling dialogue system virtual assistant? It is, again, limited to the range of actions it is able to take. If you're talking about your, Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, all of those have produced corporate spy bots, which are in many of our homes. You can get it to take some action. There are some communicative intents that it can recognize. But a language model that is just something that's generating plausible sounding strings of text uses a chatbot, we're back to no. It's not able to recognize any communicative intent. Yes, I missed Bixby on that one, Samsung, I think. So these are simple degenerative cases. And they also show that having and recognizing minimal communicative intents isn't enough to do full communication. And I want us to keep that in view because the language models like GPT-3 sort of seem very, very fluent. And so it seems like they can do more than they can. In connection with that idea that this is minimal and not getting us to full communication, there's this paper that I quite enjoyed by Kopp and Kramer, who argue that work on what's called conversational AI, that is chatbots driven by language models, has taken a very behavioralist turn. And in doing so is failing to model the aspects of human-human interaction that make that interaction a joint activity. That is, behaviorist conversational AI is not doing anything about co-construction of meaning or about mentalizing, that is, understanding or positing a model of mind about the other person. In other words, if an agent can only recognize pre-programmed communicative intents, it cannot engage in the fullness of intersubjective joint activities. All right, I have an interlude for you here because there's a question I keep getting, and it's to the point that I feel like I have to tell people about it. I don't think anyone in this audience will be making this argument, but I'm sort of putting this out there in the world because I don't want to keep being the target of this argument. People will say, but aren't people just stochastic parrots too? Picking up on the title of my paper that Google made famous. And it'll come in the form of, how do I know that you aren't just reflecting back patterns of language use? Or when language models are just, stitching together arbitrary parts of their training data to produce seemingly coherent text, isn't that just what people do? This argument is inherently dehumanizing, because surely the person making that argument perceives their own agency in speaking and otherwise. And in asking this question, they're basically at best casting doubt that I have similar agency, i.e. full humanity. Thank you for that reference to Lovelace. I will go look. So I have now a ground rule that I refuse to engage in argument with someone who doesn't actually posit my humanity as a baseline part of the presuppositions of the conversation. And so I don't engage this one anymore, but I did want to let you know about it. All right, so where are we in this overall talk plan? I've talked about meaning making in human-human conversation. I've talked about computers and communicative intent. And now I'm going to transition into looking at what happens when humans encounter computer-generated text, including some failure modes and risks. First, I'm going to show you a non-linguistic example to illustrate how we can't help but make meaning when we see certain things. So this is a video. It has no sound. That was part of an experiment by Heider and Simmel in the early 1940s, where they found that people were very willing to attribute personality characteristics to shapes and construct a narrative based only on the movement of the shapes. So please enjoy this minute-long video. If I can get it to play. There you go. All right, thank you for watching that and for commenting about it. And I gave this same talk as a dry run to my lab group this morning, and big triangle is a bully verbatim showed up in the chat there too, right? So this is, not only do people attribute personality characteristics, but we get sort of recurring interpretations of this. My colleague, Dr. Meg Mitchell, in this podcast episode that she and I did with This Week in Machine Learning, that the link is there for, brought up this example. And she said, if we'll do that much interpretation of just shapes moving around, how much more do we do when the synthetic information that we are perceiving is actually language, which is something so human and personal and sort of visceral to us? So I really like that point. So I went and dug up the video. All right. When we do this meaning making, another important point is that we bring our own context. So not only will we make meaning out of text or speech or sign from languages we know, we will do so based on the context that we bring to that situation. So if you think about these different contexts, we have the person with the little dog and the person with the big dog and the person who's sort of gleefully dog free and the person who's maybe very concerned about what signs are telling them to worry about, and then the linguist here, right? Our context is going to inform how we interpret things. And part of that context is our interpretation of what the computer is doing. And that's an important part of it. So I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of this now, where things either have gone wrong or could go wrong. And in some cases, the resulting artifacts that I'm showing you to illustrate this are offensive or otherwise difficult to see. So I just want to flag that and give you a warning. The examples are going to involve stereotypes regarding Black Americans, machines urging self-harm, stereotypes about the Kannada language of Southern India, dehumanization of Native people, and stereotypes about Palestinians. And my point here is to alert you to the fact that these and other such examples exist, but I realize that there's some harm in repeating them even with that framing. So I wanted to do the framing and say I'm very open to feedback on how to convey this message. If you have an idea of how to do it better and you have the energy and inclination to share it with me. And if you don't want to see this, this is about 12 slides, so 10 to 12-ish minutes. And when I get to the ones that are sort of images and not just text, I will give another warning about that. So with that, moving into the examples. The first example involves templatic generation and the automatic placement of text. And this is the foundational work of Dr. Latanya Sweeney published in 2013. And what she noticed and then very thoroughly documented was that at that time, in the ads served up by Google, African-American sounding names triggered this ad copy about getting information about a person, where the same service was advertised differently for white sounding names. This is problematic, and Sweeney's work was a very careful documentation of how this really is somewhere in the algorithm, so the choices of the advertiser and also the algorithmic design, and not at all in sort of underlying data in the world about real people. So in this context, what, if any, communicative intent does the machine or the corporation behind it have? Probably click here so we can get paid. And we're going to produce these different versions of the ad because we had this idea that given our racist society, these versions might, in some cases, be more useful. Yeah. And then there's the possibility of a feedback loop, that the corporation was trying to maximize the ad revenue. And so as users encountered this and were more likely to click if it was a pairing of arrest record plus African-American sounding name, and more likely with the white sounding names to click on the other type of ad, that produced a feedback loop that then changed what got served up. Really nefarious situation. What are the perlocutionary consequences here? Well, again, as well documented by Dr. Sweeney, this casts suspicion on the person being searched for, regardless of the search context. Yeah, algorithms are not neutral, absolutely. And this whole story started because she was in a colleague's office, and that colleague wanted to find one of her papers, and so put in her name, and then up popped this ad. And she's like, what's that ad doing there? And then very quickly could imagine, what if it wasn't me talking to my colleague, but what if this was someone who was applying for a job? And the search committee was looking up their name and sort of getting this subliminal information that maybe this person isn't a good choice. really awful and like real world perlocutionary consequences. My next set of examples have to do with untethered generation, and that's where machines are just sort of set to blather on without any commitment to the truth or grounding. So one very famous example of this was the Twitter chatbot Tay that Microsoft launched in March 2016 and then pulled back down within 24 hours. It was designed to learn from its human interlocutors, and supposedly it was going to like pick up fun things to say and speech styles. And very quickly, people got a hold of it who wanted to train it to say things that were sexist and racist and so on. And they succeeded, and Microsoft had to pull that back off. Another example, much more recently, is GPT-3 has been used to create something called Philosopher Ai, which was this chatbot where you could ask it supposedly questions around philosophy and it would give you philosophical answers. And yet another person, not the Philosopher AI developer, then used that to create automated responses to questions on Reddit. And it was detected not because it was saying things that didn't seem plausible or like what a human would say, but because it was too prodigious. No human could have been typing that much. And so someone noticed, and it was revealed that this was actually GPT-3, basically. Along the way, it engaged in discussions of sensitive topics, including conspiracy theories and suicide, with no no commitment to any truth or grounding or accountability for what was said. There's a company in France that was looking at GPT-3 and thinking about various healthcare applications. And one of the things they tried was, well, what if we set this up as a chatbot therapist? They didn't actually put it in conversation with any patients. They just simulated that. And they found that it sort of cheerfully encouraged self-harm. Because again, GPT-3 does not know what it's talking about. And then finally, there was a study by McGuffey and Newhouse last year that looked into whether GPT-3 could be used by somebody who wanted to populate online fora for recruiting people to extremist causes. And I guess the need there that we would hope remained unfilled is to make it feel like there's a lot of people in this space and that the person being recruited is joining a big group. And so having a bunch of not necessarily fully sensible text that was kind of on topic and kind of from the same viewpoint would fill that need. So what, if any, communicative intent does the machine have here? I would say it's engagement without any commitment to content in all of these cases. How does public commitment or accountability function here? Well, since there's no control over the specific content, it's hard to imagine which human or organization would want to be accountable for it. I guess in the one case where if you actually had an extremist organization trying to recruit people, it's not exactly accountability that they're interested in. So that would be a case where they would want to. But anyone interested in accountability, I think, would want to stay far away from this. And perlocutionary consequences, well, they're varied and drastic, especially in scenarios where the machine is presented as possibly human or even artificial but knowledgeable. All right, now I'm going to shift over to some examples involving search because they turn up the issues very nicely. Starting with an experience that I actually had. So in March 2020, beginning of the pandemic, I was seeking to help an older relative with a medical question. And it basically came down to, does this person go into the ER right now when we're trying to like all shelter in place, or will they be okay at home for, I think they'd had a fall. They're fine now. So story ends well. And so I'm like, okay, well, this person needs to talk to an urgent care nurse line. So let me search for that. And it's late at night and I'm a little bit stressed. And I ran into a really unfortunate confluence of our broken healthcare system here in the US and the way that Google search returns snippets out of context. So here's what it looked like. The first result that I got, and these are screen caps from my phone, showed me things like this. Our nurses can help you decide whether you need to see a doctor. Go to an urgent care clinic or emergency room. Like, yes, that's my question. Okay, great. Here's a phone number that I gave to the person I was trying to help, and then only afterwards figured out that this was not a general anyone can call 24-hour nurse care line. It was only for enrolled patients. And I eventually twigged to that because this is actually my own health insurance. I think I had said, oh, UW Medicine, that's here, great. And then I realized, wait a minute, that's a specific healthcare plan. That's no good. Well, damage already done. My relative is on hold. But I start looking, okay, I actually know that the person in question is covered by Medicare. So let me find the Medicare version of this. So here's my next thing, Medicare Nurse Hotline. And I get this helpful looking result. Okay, it's medicare.gov, checks out. You can also call 1-800-Medicare. Great, sounds good. Well, no, that was actually a phone number for questions about Medicare benefits, not really relevant to my search about a nurse line, but the way Google pulled that information out of context made it look like it was. I finally found the right answer, which was this one. And it took a long time because at this point I'm now trained, I'm looking only for Medicare, but actually the service that Medicare contracts with for this thing is called Medica. Okay, so what's going on here? Again, the same set of questions. And I have to say, end of story, person's fine. But what, if any, communicative intent does the machine have? Well, here they're trying to provide some string which answers the user's question by highlighting the most relevant snippet out of the document that was deemed to be an answer to the question. Who is publicly committed to the message? Well, the underlying text with its full context was, the author of the web page. So for example, UW Medicine, but that had the full context. The coherence relation of answer, this snippet answers your question, that belongs to Google. That's their responsibility. Perlocutionary consequences? Well, in this case, it was wasted time on hold with the wrong service. And I just want to point out that zooming in on the first snippet that I saw there was these deictic pronouns, right? So you decide, you need, and then the implicit you in the imperative. And it seemed perfectly reasonable to me in that moment to understand that you as referring to me, the person reading it, because I lacked the overall context that this thing was drawn from, where that would have helped narrow down that you to people who are actually patients enrolled with this particular health plan. All right, oops, sorry. This is where my next warning comes. We're now getting into 5 more slides. Let's see. Yes, 5 more slides of offensive examples. So if you want to take a 5-minute break, totally understandable. I'm now talking about cases where the answer is incorrect and presented authoritatively. So this is now fixed. Google has squashed this particular bug, but at a certain point in the last year or so, if you typed in, when did people come to America? You got this result that spoke as if people only refers to the settlers that started arriving in the early 1600s. At the same time, if you ask the question as when did humans come to America, you got an answer that still is definitely within a Western view of what's going on with people in the Americas, but I think is at least a more appropriate answer than the previous one. So again, what was the communicative intent here? Provide an answer to the user's question from a linked document, pulling out the most relevant snippet. Who is publicly committed to the message? The underlying text with its full context in this case is the US Library of Context, which gets the yikes icon because that was a sort of history of the Americas site that basically started with Jamestown, as if that's when history starts here. So yikes to US Library of Congress, but also yikes to Google, because Google's the one who said, we're positing the coherence relation of answer between your question and this snippet. What are the perlocutionary consequences? Well, what might the searcher learn from this answer? And I think we should consider in this case, especially both native and non-native children in the US who might have this question and think to go to Google for it. Another one, fairly recently, if you ask Google ugliest language in India, it would say the answer is Kannada, a language spoken by around 40 million people in South India, and would offer to let you hear that insult out loud if you wanted. Yeah. Another one in the same vein, if someone thought to write, what do terrorists wear on their head? Google links to the Wikipedia page that is not talking about terrorists, all right? It's talking about the Palestinian keffiyeh and what that means and what it looks like. And it should in no way be an answer to this question. I rather think that this pairing happened because of the way language models map words to similar points in their vector space based on the general web garbage that they are trained on. All right, so again, what's the communicative intent here? Same as before. What about public commitments? in this case, there's the interesting twist that those questions, so what's the ugliest language in India, and what does a terrorist wear on their head, have invalid presuppositions in them. But if you answer a question with an invalid presupposition, then you are implicitly accepting that presupposition into the common ground. That is, you are validating the presupposition. And for discussion of that in the linguistic context, see Laskaridis and Ashra 2009, this Kim et al. 2021 paper is actually a computational approach to trying to identify presuppositions and fact check them first before answering the question, which seems like a really interesting direction of research. By answering these questions, Google is committing to things like there is some language that is recognized as the ugliest, and there is some characteristic headgear for terrorists. And then they are further committing to the specific answers that they offer, right? Presumably, Google would not want to have those commitments. And in fact, once these things get pointed out and people make a fuss on Twitter, someone inside Google reacts and those searches no longer have that effect. But it's not a systematic solution, because I'm sure you can find a similar question that causes similar problems, as Eric just pointed out there. So if you ask Google, when did women come to America? The top answer is in November 1619. Absolutely not true. All right, so what are the prelusionary consequences here? Well, who's going to ask that question, right? Probably somebody who holds the belief that's presupposed in those questions, and they get those beliefs reinforced. Someone who is subject to the stereotype being shown might not be the one asking the question, but they might still somehow be exposed to the question answer pair. And then they get the psychological harm of the stereotype being repeated, plus the sense that, in air quotes, everyone must think so, for Google to be reflecting it back like that. So I want to point out that this isn't just about decontextualizing information, pulling it out of its context, but there's also some recontextualizing going on. And Dr. Sophia Noble's amazing book, Algorithms of Oppression from 2018, is a great study of this, where she points out that this was already a problem with search results that were just a list of web pages. So this is, like, again, a long quote, but I want to read it because it's wonderful. In essence, the social context or meaning of derogatory or problematic Black women's representations in Google's ranking is normalized by virtue of their placement, making it easier for some people to believe that what exists on the page is strictly the result of the fact that more people are looking for Black women in pornography than anything else. This is because the public believes that what rises to the top in search is either the most popular or the most credible, or both. And I think that's a very accurate description of how people encounter and make sense of Google search results. And it is not at all an accurate description, as Noble was saying, of what's actually going on inside the algorithm. So that was already a problem with search results as a list of web pages, and similarly with image search results. And it's now exacerbated when snippets are pulled out from pages, and exacerbated even further with answer boxes. Okay, we are done with the problems, and now on to thinking about what can we do to do this better. And I don't have specific answers, but I have things to consider that I think can help us get to answers. So when we are designing applications involving text that is generated or placed in open-ended ways, we should be considering a nuanced view of how meaning making happens, keeping in mind that questions and answers aren't just text strings or even just logical forms, but actually part of a richer communicative system. Furthermore, we need to keep in mind that people will interpret strings in languages they know by building a model of mind of a person or entity or group behind the text, using the context that the string appears in, and also using the context that they bring to the interaction. We should also be considering who's going to be encountering and interpreting the text. And we should do this by considering many different kinds of people and experiences. And here I'm drawing on ideas from value-sensitive design that involve identifying stakeholders and thinking about many different positionalities. So what happens when it's a child who's encountering this? What happens when it's a person with a strong prejudice that they may be seeking to get, comfort that they're right, in air quotes? What if it's someone who is subject to the stereotypes being reflected back to them? What if it's someone who has limited understanding of the fallibility of computers? Or what if it's someone like me in my nurse helpline example, who actually is pretty clear on the fallibility of computers, but is stressed or busy or tired, or for whatever reason, not paying that much attention to what's going on in the particular sourcing of the information? We should also think about accountability, as I mentioned earlier. So when, if ever, is it appropriate to do untethered text generation? And not only who actually is accountable for the text, but who are the people encountering the text going to attribute it to? Is this going to be, oh, well, this must be right because Google is such a powerful, wonderful corporation. They have a lot of authority, or this must be right because I believe Google to be just sort of showing me the world as it is, as people like to say. They're just summarizing what happened in all those results. And that's, again, Sophia Noble's point. Or, is it a chatbot that's being run by some company and speaking for that company in some way, and so on. When should an organization be comfortable with untethered or even partially guided natural language generation being done in its name? And I would say only after very careful testing. And then what about cases where people unleash bots like that Reddit answer bot without an obvious responsible operator? And how do we account for that and constrain it? So what are some things to do? I think we need to be curating training data way more than we are. We don't want to be working in a paradigm where we hoover up all the garbage on the web, because we know that it can be spat back out. And when it's spat back out, it's not just sitting there harmlessly, but it's being interpreted by humans. Also, transparency and visibility to users is really important. The absolute bare minimum is that it should always be clear when the interlocutor is a machine versus when you're talking to a person. It should also be clear to the user or the person encountering the machine what the affordances of the machine are, what it actually can do and what it can't do. And it should be clear where the information comes from, right? What is that source corpus that I am giving you answers based on? And in what ways might this result be inaccurate? More transparency involves minimizing claims to authority. I don't think Google should be answering questions. I don't think it actually has that authority, even though it's pretty good at claiming it. We also need to not present the web as total or so big that it must be representative of everything. And I think there's also some tasks that are probably never appropriate. And here I want to pick in particular on this idea of learning to cite. That comes from this paper by Metzler et al. In SIG-IR Forum this year, where they're talking about replacing search, where at least you can like click through and go figure out the context for that information, with chatbots. And they point out quite correctly that one of the problems here is you lose the ability to click through and see where it was. And so their proposed solution to this is we should add another machine learning task, which is learning how to output appropriate citations that go with the claims that are going into the text. But that's not a good replacement, right? It's not that I want some citation that's maybe relevant. I want the source of that particular piece of information. And so I think this sort of like open-ended generation of citations as like a, yeah, I can just drop that into, is a terrible idea that shouldn't be done. All right, we can also think about this in policy terms, and I think we need to. We need to think about what we want to do as a society in terms of how information systems are shaped. Right now, we live in a moment where they're shaped by advertising and other corporate interests. And I think we need to get back to a situation where information systems are shaped by the public interest. And here again, I refer you to Dr. Sophia Noble's book, which is very much about this. I think we need to think about what policies we can put in place to avoid amplifying biased views, especially those held by the majority and those in power. And then finally, and very clearly not making it the only solution. Like, we can't get out of this by just making sure that all the people have better information literacy, but I think we also need to think about promoting information literacy in the face of these technologies as they exist now. And then finally, a sort of individual level word of advice to you, and hopefully you'll pass this on to other people, is don't be too impressed, right? Just because that text seems coherent, if it came from a computer, it doesn't mean the model behind it has actually understood anything or is trustworthy in any way. Just because that answer was correct doesn't mean the next one will be. It could well have happened to get one right, and the next thing it says might be ridiculously wrong. And then finally, when a computer seems to speak our language, we're actually the ones doing all the work. So to summarize where we've been, and thank you so much for coming along and for keeping the chat so lively. I talk some about, as humans, how remarkably quick we are to make meaning of language as we encounter it, and furthermore, to imagine the mind behind that language. In contrast, artificial agents have at best limited capacity for communicative intent, and some natural language systems have none. And if we're going to mitigate the risks of language technology, we have to recognize that contrast and account for it rather than taking advantage of it. And finally, as promised, I've got the link to my slides one more time, and I'm really excited to hear what your questions are.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That was fascinating and raises a huge number of questions. So I just want to remind people that you can ask questions by raising your hand if you would like to speak, and then I will unmute you to let you ask the question. Or if you prefer, you can put your question in the Q&A window, and then I'll read them.
Thank you all. I'm enjoying the appreciation in the chat. Let's see. It looks like Brighton has a question that's in the chat, maybe. Not in the Q&A, but I'll pick it up while we're waiting for something else to come.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. They say Reddit ran a social experiment where an NLP model tried to sound as human as possible by using constantly inputted human responses, and humans would have to guess which text was machine generated or which was human. So a Turing test. Strangely, I don't remember problematic biases surfacing on the model. Instead, humans just shifted to math problems or spaced text, so SPACE, that the model couldn't replicate. So I wonder if they implemented safeguards to filter out certain human responses, or if the tug of war game distracted the humans. So I guess it's possible that you could run a social media-based experiment where it was set up so that the machine would learn from humans and the humans just decided to be well-behaved that day. That can happen. And in terms of like how blatant the biases are, it probably depends a lot on what the original training data was. There's no such thing as a completely unbiased data set, but we can certainly make better and worse versions.
There's a question in the Q&A that I'll read. Do you have any thoughts on YouTube's algorithm circulating white supremacist content to young men in recent years?
Thoughts. So I think that I want to, I mean, obviously awful. And the questions that it raises for me are, what do we do about it? And in particular, what would be appropriate policy or regulation that could help prevent that? And there's various things along the lines of, so transparency, right? So not only the direct users, but the indirect stakeholders should be able to tell what's going on. I think it took a while before people at large knew that this was happening, the ones who weren't getting sort of sucked down that rabbit hole. And so what is it that we need to put in place so that public interest groups can actually hold companies accountable when they're doing this? And then, yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of creative thought that needs to go into how do we prevent this? And there's sort of two parts to the puzzle, right? There's should that content be allowed in the first place? And then how accessible should it be? And the how accessible question includes to what extent can the recommendation algorithm surface it? And there's no neutral position here, right? Just letting the stuff run rampant clearly has real world harm. And if you are going to go down the path, as I think we have to, of saying we are going to disallow, or at least sort of not give a large platform to certain content deemed problematic, then that deeming of what's problematic, it becomes this open question of, okay, how do we make sure that those decisions are made in a way that is democratic, in the sense that people who are going to be negatively affected by it have a say. And it's not just, well, the platform gets to decide. and so on. And I just want to, while I'm on this particular soapbox, you hear a lot of stuff these days about the benefits of democratizing AI. And I think the problem with that usage is that it's used to refer only to this idea that we're going to put out, we're going to make it possible for lots of people to use and build this technology. That's democratizing. And it misses the other part of what democracy means, which is broad participation in decision making, and not just broad participation in using and building the technology. So I think if we're going to actually solve these problems of platforms becoming this place where hateful content is rampant, it needs to involve democratized decision making, where the people who have been most marginalized are actually quite empowered, if not the most empowered. I hope that addresses the question.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat, or in the Q&A rather. Do you think, this is from Diana Baumgartner-Zhang, do you think that the people who created these systems / models should be taking something similar to Hippocratic Oath?
It's an interesting question. So I think that part of the solution here is better awareness of the issues on the part of the developers. But you can have the most enlightened workforce, and if the decision makers who are saying, well, this is where we're going to put our effort, are driven by profit motive unchecked by appropriate regulation, it's not going to be enough. So I think having a better sense of the way our technology behaves in the world positions developers to try to say no, to know that there's something that should be thought about, and ultimately to build better technology. But I don't think we can solve it only through doing that. The other thing I like about your metaphor here is that the Hippocratic Oath, of course, comes from medicine. And it's striking when you contrast the medical research literature with the machine learning research literature, where the medical research literature is very carefully scoped and hedged, and okay, we can only claim this much because this is how our experiment went. And the machine learning folks will claim the moon, the stars, the whole universe based on incredibly flimsy results. And so, yes, there's a lot to be learned from other fields, especially like medicine, that see themselves as involved with protecting individual humans and humanity. Not that medicine is perfectly ethically wonderful, but there's a tradition there that I think we probably could benefit from importing into machine learning, including as applied to language. I hope that answered it.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Oh, Eric Swanson asks, thanks so much for this talk. When I teach similar material, I emphasize model attribution in interpretation as opposed to intent attribution. I like this way of going since there are a lot of examples of AI models gone awry. Could you say more about why you emphasize intent attribution?
Yeah, thanks. That's an interesting question. I think I'm emphasizing intent attribution because I'm coming at this with my linguist hat on, thinking about, okay, what do we know as linguists about how humans do language, and what happens when those humans are doing language with a machine, and but applying the things that we usually apply to do the joint activity that is communication with other people. And so looking at it through that lens, I think brings my focus to intent rather than model, which I hope answers the question.
Thank you. Other questions? I have a question I'll go ahead and ask, sort of a follow-on to the one about the Hippocratic Oath, which is, do you feel that it's possible to have an information source like Google that is not curated, that's not, I mean, is that the only way to avoid these issues?
So is it the only way to avoid these issues to curate the information source? Not necessarily. So I think that, I mean, there's a whole field of information science that's all about how do we curate, but also manage information. And you could imagine taking something that's a search engine, but adding transparency to how did we find the documents that we're putting into this in the first place, right? So Google doesn't index absolutely everything on the web, right? It's a lot, but it's not everything. So there's a set of decisions there. Those decisions can be made apparent. Information about, where does this document that I found fit in with other documents could be made more apparent. And also information about what's happening when you issue a query and the search engine returns something could be more honest. So it's not Google's answering your questions, or now the voice assistant is answering your questions, but rather something that more wears on its sleeve what the technology is actually doing. And I think that would be an improvement.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Julia Elizabeth Mendelson has a question. I've seen a bit of NLP work on explicitly mitigating bias in model outputs, e.g. binary gender and word embeddings. I'm curious what you think of this line of work and how it fits into this idea of the lack of communicative intent of computers.
Yeah. So brief history of word embeddings and then bias in word embeddings in NLP. Starting in the early 2010s, the notion of representing words in terms of distributional semantics, like sort of caught fire. And the early versions of this were things like word to vec, that basically gave vector space representations of words in terms of their co-occurrence with other words in an underlying corpus. And then with the large language models, we started getting word embeddings pulled out of those that were even richer and even closer. And it was revolutionary in NLP. So all of these technologies that had been sort of kind of maybe working based on lemmas became much, much better when you represented the words as vector space word embeddings, because you could take advantage of synonymy relations and other things like that. So people got very excited, lots of sort of impressive results coming out throughout the 2010s. And not too far into that, people started saying, well, wait a minute, what all exactly is being picked up in this distributional semantics? So I think it starts in about 2015, and some of the early references are Boluk-Bassi et al. And Kaliskan et al. And they find gender bias, they find racial bias, all of these things, because as society, encodes and reproduces sexism and racism and ableism and everything like that, it comes out in the patterns of words that we use to talk about things. And if we say our representation of the meaning of words is what they co-occur with, then that's going to be there in these representations, and we need to account for that. So pretty quickly, in fact, Boluk-Bassi et al. Not only document it, but also try a first debiasing. People are saying, well, there's a real problem. It's going to have societal implications. And here's a technological fix for it. We can take these vector space representations and we can just sort of move the vectors around in systematic ways so that, for example, the occupation terms are no longer aligned with gender in various ways. And, that seems like a step in the right direction. It attracted an enormous amount of attention, I think partially because it seemed like a way that you could do some good in the world and maybe deal with these important social issues in a way that was entirely technological, which of course isn't true. Like, that's not going to solve these problems. And there ends up being, evidence that in fact it doesn't really work. So there's a paper by Hila Gonen and Yoav Goldberg in 2019 showing that it's called Lipstick on a Pig. The existing methods for debiasing word vectors, specifically around gender, didn't actually remove the bias. It just made it not possible to measure with the way they had been measured. And so the clusters of words still reflected the gender biases. So where does that leave us, and how does it fit in with communicative intent of computers? I think what it means is it's important to know that this stuff is there. It's important to think about how we're using the word embeddings, and it's important to think about how we're using the technology. So when you have word embeddings that put the word terrorist close to Palestine, and then you throw those word embeddings into your search engine, you're going to get results like the one that I show about the headwear. And so sort of delving deep into what does this mean practically and what are the use cases is important. I think it also means that we do want to take some care with the data that we're putting in, because like I said, you can't fully debias either the data set or the resulting vectors, but you can certainly make it worse and refrain from making it worse. And then in terms of lack of communicative intent of computers, how to bring this rant around to the way I structured this talk, I think it comes back to when people interpret language coming from a computer and they think the computer is like choosing to say that thing to them, there's also the sense of computers are objective machines, right? And so when this bias stuff comes through an objective machine, it gets this notion of, oh, that's probably not just a false stereotype, then the computer said so. And so it's important to be even more careful. And the name for that, by the way, is automation bias, that we tend to look at the output of a machine as more reliable than what a human would do. And we need to really account for that in the design and transparency, so that we don't end up amplifying these biases. I hope that addressed the question.
Thank you. Other questions? I see that there's a hand. Oh, here, Dominique has a question. I'll try to unmute you now.
Hello. This is really cool and like really interesting. And I don't know a ton about like NLP and programming, but like I use the internet too much. So like some of this I've already kind of come across and like heard people talking about. So it's cool to see it so like linguistically framed. But in talking about solutions, and this is kind of like a it's too much, Kelly. But in talking about possible solutions, and this is kind of a like, let's make it about the individual instead of society, which is like not a good take. But I also wonder how much of this could be helped by like reframing how we talk about like computers and apps and things. So not just as like objective machines, but as like I guess like an example is like I say thank you to Bixby because like it feels rude not to, but like Bixby is a machine, not a person. And so in kind of giving them like friendly voices and telling jokes and things like that, like how much of that, because I think in some ways we use computers and phones and technology so often. Also, I apologize, I'm winded. I'm getting over a cold. But so we use them so often that they're just kind of like there, but sometimes it's like, I don't want to say like a friend, but I think there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between like, this is a machine that's been programmed and is kind of, there's a question here somewhere, but like, is that making sense? Like,
it is making sense, yeah. And there's a lot of issues in there. So you said, they're given friendly voices and friendly demeanors, and in fact, a lot of them are gendered female. And there's a whole range of problems in there as we have all of these entities around us that sort of exist to be ordered around and sort of serve our needs, and they're almost all feminized. So that's a problem. And some of the work on this is just appalling. So I was at a talk where there's a whole range of work looking at empathy and sort of like making these things seem empathetic and seem personable. And the speaker was very proud of the fact that they gave their chatbot the persona specifically of an 18-year-old woman. And I was like, why did you have to do that? And like, they had all of these various characteristics that they were indexing on 18-year-old woman, but instead of saying those characteristics, they said 18-year-old woman. And it's like, don't, right? So, back to your point about what do we do about this? Is it good? Is it bad that these things seem friendly and that we form attachments to them? And, there's one of the sort of pro-social use cases of actually it was a Chinese company, so I think it was a Chinese woman in the case that I was talking about. But these prototypical, let's make them friendly. One of the prototypical pro-social use cases is to keep people company when they're lonely, right? And there is some value there. But the question is, how do you do that while also keeping things appropriately scoped and not making these overclaims of authority? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that it's going to involve transparency, and again, like not pushing too hard on the, we can get humans to react to this as if it were humans, so let's just play into that and see how far we can go. I think we need to be thoughtful about that direction. But yeah, we're gonna form attachments. I mean, how many people who own cars name their cars, right? And think of them as somewhat anthropomorphized. Like that's a thing, and it's going to happen. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but we need to account for it as we're designing the technology.
Thank you. Other questions?
I want to react to what Savaya just put in the chat. Because yes, reminding of the show Black Mirror, there's a researcher at Colorado University, I think, Casey Fiesler, who's got this exercise that she calls Black Mirror Writer's Room, which is all around helping people imagine possible negative outcomes by writing Black Mirror show pitches around particular technology. Yeah, if you search using your favorite search engine for Black Mirror Writer's Room, I think you'll turn up that exercise. It's pretty neat. And as far as I know, none of this has actually been made into Black Mirror episodes, but that would also be really cool. Yeah, so opposite of what a therapist tells you to do. Yeah, exactly. So in tech, right, there's all of these like user stories and thinking about use cases and user scenarios. And the standard way of doing that is like, here's what happens when the people love our product so much. And there's something called design noir, which is a technique from value sensitive design. Paper is Nathan et al. 2007, where it's like, okay, do that, but imagine what could go wrong. And in particular, imagine that the technology became pervasive, and then take the perspective of somebody who the technology wasn't designed to serve and see what happens. And sort of think that through. And that can be really useful in helping to sort of cut through the hype that leads to some of these overly optimistic designs. I was just filling space waiting for a question. I want to hear what you all have to say.
You would think that some of the companies producing these digital assistants would give users the choice of what kind of voice.
Some of them do. And actually, isn't it Siri? Someone recently came out with a few more voices. So I don't know that they've gone non-binary yet, but at least there's more than one gender available now, and also some that sound like Black Americans. Has anyone played with that on? Dominique says the other Bixby voices are kind of creepy.
Other questions? Charlie O'Hara has a question. This is a bit heady of a question, but it feels to me like one of the problems is that we want our computers to, in scare quotes, care about us, but they can't because they're computers. It's probably a bit out of our wheelhouse, but like, do you think we could get computers to care about us or have intent?
So getting computers to care about us sounds like some of these high AI questions that I'm not a good person to comment on. That's not my research area. But in terms of having intent, I think in a very narrow sense they can, right? So your voice assistant has a range of intents that it can, well, that it can recognize, but can it have intent? Right. So yes, I think you can program in like goals. And the question is, are those goals, things that you are, that you want to be in relationship with as you're working with the computer? And to what extent does the human who's using the computer have control over that goal, and also other humans that might be affected by it? And one of the sort of ongoing themes that I see as I think about this stuff is when we've automated something and we sort of put it out in the world to like set it and forget it, that thing is going to keep going, and it's going to keep going with that same programming, and the context around it can change. And so our designs also need to be robust to that. And I think in some cases it's the design of governance and maintenance of technology that's really concerned, as opposed to the technology itself. And so if we're going to start having computers that have intent, that intent has to be designed to fit in with human intents around it, and then be flexible or at least endable as the context around it changes.
Thank you. Other questions? You just said basically that you don't really have an answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway, which is I was struck when you talked about GPT-3, saying that it's essentially going back because it doesn't have any intent. And I see what you mean, and I agree actually, but just to play the devil's advocate or pretend that I'm someone who, or take the position of the people who have strong positive, or take a strong stance on neural nets. What about Turing's paper? So Turing basically said that it doesn't matter whether there's a soul there, as long as we can impute a soul to it, so to speak. That is, if we impute intelligence to it, it has intelligence. So if we impute the structure to it, it has the structure or the intent.
So I find myself so frequently being asked to disagree with Turing, and that's such a, like, Turing was such a giant, but I think Turing was, at least in terms of does the Turing test show intelligence? I think no. And I think that, you know, at the time that he was writing, it was really hard to predict what we would see now. But also Turing wasn't a linguist. And so Turing didn't have much appreciation for what happens on the listener side of language processing. But the way you phrase it just now, so it doesn't matter if it has intelligence or a soul, if we impute it, then it does. My answer to that is, let's not then. That we are better off not imputing intelligence to these things, given what we see them doing in our society.
Right. Other questions? Acrisio has a question.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Hi there. This was a very interesting talk. I actually wanted to ask a question just as a follow-up on this comment that you made on Steve's point. So of course, I mean, we don't want to attribute intent to computers, but in that, so I'm thinking about the perspective of the listener, or the person who's trying to make sense out of something that is not going to have intent. And so let's take the context of interaction with dogs and pets in general. So what would you say in that context that it would be similar to the interaction with the computer?
Well, I'm not an animal researcher, psychologist, whatever, so I don't have a lot to say about, you know, to the extent to which other animals have intents, but I think that they are more like us than computers are. And, you know, certainly as living beings, right, they're going to have drives to, for example, get food and get rest and get affection. And so I think that they do have intents, and they do have some ability to recognize ours, dogs more than cats. And then also, if we think about what I was just saying about, do we impute intelligence? You know, what's the result of that, right? If you are a very doting pet owner and you think that your animal is, you know, the most intelligent, amazing being on the planet, you might annoy some of the people around you, but I don't think you're going to be causing harm to society at large the way that some of these systems can if they get deployed out into the world. So I see less danger there. Julia says, cats totally recognize their intents. They just don't care. Yeah, my cats can recognize my intent to feed them, except that they recognize it more frequently than it actually happens.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We should probably wrap up, and we can continue the discussion in the reception portion. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was delightful.
This was really incredible, and we appreciate it very much. I'm going to put the link for the reception in the chat. Although I think I should probably wait till all the applause dies down. Okay, so here's the link to the reception, and it's also on the calendar for the people who have access to the Linguistics calendar. So I think we'll take a few minutes pause, give you a chance to catch your breath, and we'll meet over at the other link in about 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. I look forward to it.
Thank you.